Good morning, everybody. Good morning. All right, I'm going to stand here because all the pictures of me speaking will look like this if I stand behind the podium. I loved all the cybers in Senator Warner's talk. I do want to make a couple of comments or corrections there. This is probably the wrong place to do it. But I just want to mention that you don't necessarily need a degree to work in cyber. I have precisely 0 degrees, so don't let that stop you. Although seriously, though, stay in school. Don't be like me. And but if if you're already on that track, great. But don't let it hold you back if you don't get that degree. I'm going to talk about lessons that I have learned from sharing threat intelligence, from trying to get people to share nicely. It started when I became a mom, but it has not really changed all that much since then. There's just less cake and more beer. And so we're going to talk about how threat intelligence usually starts. It starts with 2 people in a bar, and they're sitting there, and you've got a friend who's at another company, and you're going, we saw something like this. Have you guys seen that? And that's how it always starts. I end up talking to people who, I ask them, are you sharing threat intelligence, with other companies? And they say yes. And I said, does your management know? And they're like, no. So the gossip is how it starts. And what we're trying to do is bring things, up to a sort of grown-up area. So here's, I'm sorry, that's not the sock, that's a pub. That could have been last night, actually. But, same thing. I don't know how many people drink on Monday morning in the sock, but probably more should. So why are we doing this? As you know, the saying is that as defenders, we have the big problem that we have to plug everything, and the attackers only need to be right once. But with sharing threat intelligence, hopefully we can flip that asymmetry so that if they are not good in their OPSEC, or if their attack is detected, they only have to mess up once. And if we can share that information quickly, then they're messed up and they have to go back and change their method of operation. Now that's a great idea, and I really applaud it, but obviously it doesn't work in a lot of similar situations, because that's kind of how we expected antivirus to work. Does anybody remember antivirus? It's like we see what they're doing, we write something to stop them, we share it everywhere, and that takes care of the problem, right? So yeah, not so much. In fact, David J. Bianco, who came up with this amazing pyramid of pain, is he in the audience? David, there you are. I want to give David a round of applause for coming up with this. There are just times when somebody encapsulates an idea so well that you just end up using it over and over and over again. I was actually going over my presentation last night, and I did a pyramid of pain in there. And then I thought, this is like the salt of threat intelligence. You can it's missing, it's just not zippy enough. And I went, no, I got to put it in there. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, you can probably see very clearly what the thing is. But the idea is that when the adversary, when we are picking up indicators at certain levels, it's at a different level, it causes a different level of pain to the adversary to change that. So for hashes, if we're passing around hashes, it is trivial for them to change it. And so you get in this huge, quick arms race where they are changing things faster than you can communicate them and detect them, block them. In my experience, hashes are really only useful to identify, first of all, maybe if you've seen something on your endpoint, but usually malware is customized these days anyway, so it's going to be a different hash. Most of the uses of hashes I see now are when you're pointing to something on VirusTotal and you want somebody to have a look at it. It's indexed by hash. Here, go look at that one. So that's a lot more static and not really what we had intended or envisioned when we thought about sharing hashes as indicators originally, but that's where we are today. IP addresses are easy. Again, there are folks who are working on trying to predict rotation of IP addresses to try to get ahead of those. Same thing with domain names, especially automatically generated ones. They're trying to figure out the patterns that adversaries are using to generate those domain names, get ahead of them, take the ones that aren't registered yet and sinkhole them. But again, that's a race that is very, very hard to win, and we're going about it the wrong way. Annoying things, you know, if there are artifacts that we are finding on the systems and endpoints, yes, they have to, you know, they're going to have to make some changes to their tools in order to change those artifacts such that we can't go look for them that easily anymore. So this is the more pain. Their actual tools, especially the ones that are being sold, that are actually being monetized by adversaries, that is going to be very annoying for them to have to change those, especially if they're in very wide use, which we do see. And then finally, the TTPs, like who they are, the methods that they are using, those are very tough for them to change. So if we're going to get out of an arms race, we really need to be sharing the stuff near the top instead, because that's harder for them to change. I kind of predict that in the future we will probably see like the bottom three being folded back out of commercial threat intelligence and back into security products, which is really where they should have been to begin with. And I think that commercial threat intelligence is good to focus on the top three. But that's my feeling on it. That's my call. So the R-CISC, that's how you pronounce it. I'm sorry, I didn't make it up. It autocorrects to Cisco on my phone. There's nothing I can do about it. The Retail Cyber Intelligence Sharing Center was formed to try to help address this problem for retailers. So we were kind of spun off from the Retail Industry Leaders Association. In Engel, the executive director, started last February. I came in June. So we sort of have become operational since that time. We're up to about 80 members of many, many different types. You would think, when you say retail, you think, you know, Best Buy, Target, that sort of thing. But we have restaurants, fast food, automotive, e-commerce companies, and even some financial institutions who do a lot with retail, who are already part of the FSISAC, have decided to join us because the type of threat intelligence that we talk about is also pertinent to them. We have a very wide population, and as you can imagine, the level of maturity is very different. There are some that are very, very high, and there are some, yeah, that need a lot of help. So it's a challenging environment to work in. These are the members that I can mention because they are on the board, but you know, the other ones are out there too. Now, a little bit about threat intelligence itself. The problem is that trust tends to happen between individuals, not between organizations. So again, if you're talking with your friend in the pub who's the CISO at this other organization, if they leave, who are you going to talk to? That breaks down pretty quickly. And the other thing is, of course, that the value depends in part on it being exclusive. You know, we know this, don't tell anybody else because we don't want the word to get out because then the adversary will find out, or this sort of thing. And I'll talk about market forces later. And you can use all sorts of fancy platforms and forums and, you know, all this kind of stuff, but in the end, whenever there's a disruption in the signal, the frequency defaults back to two people and an email. That's just the way it tends to happen. So these are all kind of the opposite of sharing, and these are the challenges that we have to work with. And speaking of challenges, I want to quote my friend Javad Malik, who talks about, you know, okay, so we have a problem. There are no problems, only opportunities. Okay, so we're facing a DDoS opportunity. So how do we deal with this? Social engineering, just like you guys do when you're trying to get into some place. Social engineering works with everybody. In fact, I would venture to say that being a CISO is the hardest social engineering job that there is. I mean, if you can get 1,000 people to click on a link, I'm not impressed. If you can get 1,000 people to stop clicking on a link, then I'll be really impressed. So we really need to get, to get people to share, we need to do this kind of social engineering. So one of the things that we do that works well for us is emphasizing that personal connection. We introduce people to one another, our members. We have events where people can get together and look each other in the face. One of the other things is it's really hard to get a response out of a group of people if you say, who wants to talk about this? Silence. Nobody wants to speak up. But if you prep them before the event or the call and say, can you bring a story to talk about this? I'm going to call on you. Then you can get the discussion going. So you got to appeal to people as individuals. You got to help them make that individual connection over and over and over again. And really, that's what all these conferences are about. Is about people meeting people. It's not about meeting groups. And I also do have to say, never underestimate the power of booze. At some of our roundtable events, you put a steak in front of somebody and some wine, and the discussion just gets amazing. So that's where a lot of stuff, especially if there are organizations that are nervous about putting things in writing, they're going to want to talk, either on the phone or in person at an event, and they will tell stories that they will not put in writing anywhere. So this is also good. If you get an opportunity to attend these sorts of events, do, because you're going to get intelligence on a very different level from what you're reading in other places. And also, as with regular threat intelligence, or social engineering, if you are trying to to work your way into an organization, people like to be helpful, and that's just human nature. So appealing to people, we have a lot of members who have said they have joined because they wanted to help make the community better. And so going to somebody and saying, I know this other organization that's having a problem with this, I know you've worked on it, would you be willing to talk with them? Almost always the answer is yes, to some extent or another. They may say, okay, we're not inviting them into our data center, but we will talk with them about what their thing is. So appealing to people's better natures actually works really well. And then another thing that I've found that works a lot is giving them reminders that they control what information they're sharing. They control the exchange. So if I'm talking to somebody, and another thing that happens a lot in the ISAC is somebody will send an anonymous request for information, and they'll want me to send it out on their behalf. So who's done some work with this, or who's seen this? And I'll send it out, and then I'll get an answer. And maybe somebody else says, I really want to know more from that submitter. Would it be okay if I talk to them? So I'll go back to the original submitter and say, oh, so-and-so would like to know if they can talk to you about it. And they'll go, oh yeah, we know them, okay. So that kind of negotiation, back and forth, happens a lot. And then, but it's their decision to decide, who to talk to, how much to say to them, and everything. So every time somebody submits something, some threat intelligence, we make sure to ask them, are you sure you sanitized it the way you want it? I want to make sure that we're going to be, we want to share this with this group of people, but if there's anybody you don't want in there, we'll take them out. All that reminder that they are in control, that also helps them feel more comfortable about sharing. And then feedback. Lots of feedback and appreciation, thanking people, saying this really made a difference when you did this. Again, it goes back to people being helpful. Not this kind of feedback, but we've given awards. Just calling people up and saying, man, thanks. I owe you a cup of coffee for doing that, and that really helps keep things flowing. Is it just me, or does that look like Hugh Laurie playing house? It really looks that way to me. So we've also been working on figuring out what other barriers there are to sharing in threat intelligence. So we went in with George Mason University on one of their master's programs was doing their capstone projects on all sorts of cybersecurity projects. So we said, why don't you try to figure out, do some surveys and interviews with our population and find out if there are other barriers to sharing that we can address. So this great group of students worked on this, and they just came out with a report. I think we're going to be publishing it soon, but I can give you a few highlights from it. One of the things is that that's keeping them from sharing, at least according to them, and I'm sorry that the numbers are really small, but they don't really matter. You can see the height of the bars, right? It's the bars that count. When we asked them, when we said, my organization needs more of the following to be able to contribute additional cyber threat intelligence, most of them said they need more confidence in the security of available sharing mechanisms. Now that's kind of interesting because we're not really sure what that means. What do you mean by security? Do you want to know if our platform is secure? Do you want to know if the people you're telling are not going to tell other people? You know, security can be technological, it can be in process, it can be in people, so, you know, we're not really sure what they meant by that. The other interesting one is information about options for protecting our information once it is shared. That's kind of letting the cat out of the bag. I'm not really sure what options we could offer them, short of saying, you know, okay, we have this, you know, triple, you know, ROT26 enciphered and then encrypted and then, you know, encased in concrete and thrown in the bottom of a pool. I'm not really sure what we can say to them there, but it's interesting that they responded that way to it. Staffing resources is a really big one, and we're going to see more of that. And interestingly enough, there's you know, maybe, I'm not sure how many organizations this translates to, but 6.3% said, no, we're good, we're already contributing enough CTI. I don't know what that means either. The other thing is that I have to acknowledge that there is a large sample bias in this, because we asked our members of the retail ISAC, and obviously they wouldn't have joined if they weren't already predisposed to sharing. So, you know, just to make that clear, that there's definite bias in these answers. But even so, I think the answers are interesting. Another one is, again, lack of staffing sources. My organization needs more of the following, either to be able to process and understand the cyber threat intelligence it receives, or to be able to act on the cyber threat intelligence it receives. So process and understand versus act on. And you can say that, the majority always need more people to process what they're going through. Everybody is overwhelmed. The Amazons of the world have too much data. No matter what size you are, you have too much data to have to deal with, and that's an ongoing problem in threat intelligence. Additional context to help make sense of the CTI it receives. Now, first of all, I hate the word context. I think it's really overused when people really mean details. So let me give you an example. Back when I was working for a state agency, we found that one of our servers was talking out to an IP address. And usually what vendors will say as context is they'll also give you the geolocation of that IP address as best as they can understand it, assuming it's not in the middle of the US, in the middle of a pond or whatever. For us, that's an additional detail. We found out that the geolocation was Romania. And we said, we're a Texas state agency. We don't do business with Romania. That's the context. And that's something that a vendor can't give you. You have to decide for yourself. So, of course, we did, you know, red alert, oh my God, you know, it's beaconing out to Romania. What are we going to do? And then we investigated, and we found out that actually we were doing business with Romania. And our Nessus professional feed had to be bought off a state contract that where the only provider was in Romania. So yeah, we were updating our Nessus feed, and everything was cool, and you know, we stood down from red alert. But again, that's the context that, you know, I think you have to be able, you need for yourself, and nobody can give you. So saying that they need additional context to help make sense of the CTI, I'm guessing they meant more details, because only they can decide whether those details are useful and what they mean. That wasn't me. Sufficient technology training for cybersecurity personnel, and again, the same 6.3%, which was probably one organization that said, now we're good. So you just never know. Templates. Templates is another thing that we came up with from this study as a possibility. So, sharing templates for filling out for, what to share in threat. Now, I'm not talking about templates like this. Here, state the direction and velocity of your pew. No, we can't do that. I finally got threat bud into a presentation. I'm so excited. Not a template like this. And not even a template like this. I don't know how many people recognize this, but this is a representation of the STIX schema. But the problem is, what we need templates for are descriptions of what you're going to share so that the organization can take it back to their management and their legal team and say, these are the types of data we want to be sharing. Is this okay? Can we just get a permission from here on out so that we don't have to keep coming back to you every time we want to share something? So if you can imagine, it's got nice pictures. That's good for management. Management, as a manager, I can say I like pictures. I'm not really sure what that, does anybody know what that indicator one is? It looks like a sea sponge. What is it? That's a thumbprint, really? Okay. But, can you imagine talking to somebody about leveraged TTPs? Their eyes are going to glaze over. So we can't get too technical about the template. What I'm talking about is more something like this. If you report a phishing attack, here are the sort of things you should consider sharing so that your report is useful. Because we will have people who will submit something and say, yeah, we got a phishing email. Well, do you want to tell us what it said? Do you want to tell us when you saw it? What was attached to it? So you would take one of these to your management and say, these are the things we want to share. We want to share the mailers. And they might say, okay, we want you to take out, the most immediate domain names or something like that. Source domains and IPs, usually nobody has a problem with that because it's where the attack is coming from. They have nothing to do with it. The time range is really useful because if other members want to look in their logs, they need to be able to narrow it down. And also, yeah, we saw this last year. Okay. And that's relevant now. How? We need to know that connection. Where they found it. So for example, our web filters caught this, or our MSSP caught it, or we found it already on our system. Those things are important, but sometimes organizations don't want to reveal what security technology they're using. So they may not want to do that. It would be helpful, but sometimes they won't do it. The actual body of the email, the target recipients, sometimes they take those out because they're very nervous about, especially if it was spear phishing, they don't want the implication that, yes, our CFO fell for that. Any attachments? It's really hard to, when you default to email, it's hard to share attachments, especially malicious ones in threat intelligence. Half of the threat intelligence discussions end up going in my spam folder for good reason, because they've all got spam strings in there. So you have to have a better, a different platform, a different method for sharing malicious attachments because they're going to get stripped right out. The impact. We really want to know sometimes whether it worked and what happened afterwards. Depending on where it landed in the kill chain, where you stopped it, we can know a little bit about it or we can know a lot. So it would be nice if we could share that, but again, they may want to have that talk. Anything, describing the kill chain stages, campaign or threat actors, people like to talk about that sometimes, but sometimes it's not really relevant, they just want it to stop. One of the most important things that our organizations want to know about from threat intelligence, first and foremost, is targeted at us. Because if it was targeted, they guess the adversary is probably going to be more persistent, they're going to have to work harder to get them out. Otherwise, if it was opportunistic, they just want to clean up and go back to work. So that's one thing that they really want to know a lot of the time. So any of this that can help them figure that out is going to be useful. And then finally, for each of these things, is it okay to know which company submitted this, or does it all have to be anonymous? Or they say, if you are sharing the recipients, or if you're sharing the impact, then we have to be anonymous. So that's the other discussion that they need to be having. So things get really complicated. Most of these folks are happy to share what they blocked. It's like, yeah, you know, we saw this, it didn't get us, we're good. Incidents, not so much. We're just getting to the point where some will call me up and say, you can share this anonymously. We had this, you know, infection, it affected 5 machines. Here's what we knew about the malware. Here's what it took to clean it up. And that's great. That's where we want to go, but that is a very hard line to cross. A lot of them don't want to expose their own tools and methods, which is fair, especially if you're sharing with a wider community and you don't know if it's going to get out to the adversary. They're worried about reprisals. Some of the threat analysts are working at a level where they really are stopping bad guys, and the bad guys don't like it. But the most important thing is that their brand reputation is more important than any liability or lack thereof. So I'm sorry, CISA people. It was a really nice effort, but all of our retailers are telling us they don't care whether they're not liable. That is not going to keep their brand reputation intact. And in fact, there are a lot of retailers who, you know, would report more. They would go to law enforcement more because they really want to stop these guys, but there's only so often that they are willing to have their name associated with this anywhere. So they will pick the really big cases that they want to stop, and they will work with law enforcement on that, but they, you know, will let the other ones go just because they don't want to keep sticking their heads up. And sometimes they've come to me and said, you know, can you go on to law enforcement on our behalf? And I'm like, I'm sorry, that's not how it works. You got to have an actual complaint. So this is the big problem. You know, legislating that companies are not going to be liable for threat intelligence is very nice, but it's not sufficient. It's never going to be. The other problem is I'm going to go on a TLP rant. TLP is a great idea. It started out really nice. The problem is that there are very different definitions of an organization. So for example, is the retail ISAC one organization, which is composed of retailers and the vendors who love them? Or are we talking about an organization of each company? Are we talking about an organization of a company plus their service providers? You know, what is that definition? And any time something comes in that's classified as TLP Amber, we have to have that conversation. What do you understand about what the range is of distribution that we're proposing here? The same thing, peers and partner organizations, who's a peer, who isn't? I don't know, but I'm getting this answer a lot. It's like, no. You cannot share this with the government, not even once. And that's a really big problem, because obviously we would like to be able to work with DHS. DHS will come to us and say, you know, can you survey your retailers and tell us what the top malware strains are that they've seen? That's pretty simple, but we've sent it out and there's like crickets. So this is an opportunity that we are still trying to figure out and work on. The other problem, which you may not have thought of, but it's definitely there. Oh, and if there's anybody who's offended by swearing, I apologize. Don't read his lips. But the problem is that, and I didn't fully appreciate this, there are two reasons why in an ISAC, the end user organizations are very nervous about vendors. First of all, they don't want to be pitched at, which, you know, you can understand that. That's fine. But even if you know, the vendors are great and are contributing information and, you know, not speaking up when they say, oh, we can help with that. The other problem is that in threat intelligence, I've heard some complaints that some commercial threat intel vendors will take intelligence that the members contribute and then package it and sell it in their own offerings without credit. And so for that reason, some retailers say, you know, we got lots of great threat intelligence, we'll share it with the members. Do not let the vendors see it. That's another barrier that we really need to work on. Because commercial threat intelligence is not, I need an adjective, happy, functional, whatever. There's some really good things happening out there, but the commercial interests are getting in the way of sharing. So, very simple example, you've all seen the threat reports that come out from vendors, and sorry for threat intel vendor representatives out here, but they will come and say, okay, we're going to launch this new report. We want to brief all of you members under embargo. Well, that's very nice that you want to brief us ahead of time so that we can get those indicators and start blocking and doing whatever it is we do with them. But do we really have to embargo this until you are ready to publish your great paper and do the press release and the press tour and all this kind of stuff? In some cases where they actually come up with a new fancy name for the malware strain, it's like, okay, so we can't say your new fancy name until it comes out. How are we supposed to talk about this? Is it like this one? Well, no, it's not like that one. It's kind of to the left. All the, these commercial interests are really, make it difficult. Exclusivity is another one. If you're trying to make it as a threat intel vendor, you need to have information that nobody else has. Again, that's completely contradictory to the idea of sharing. So they will share something with us and we'll go, okay, can we tell our members? Well, no. Okay, well, you can share this one, but that was from, like 3 weeks ago. Yeah, but that's one that we can give you for free. That's another problem. Marketing, it's really hard to convince a retailer to say, yes, they gave us the intel that helped save us, especially if you have already been in the headlines in any time in the past. You can't do that either. And then, of course, sales. You understand, you got to make sales, but when you have a bunch of vendors who are all competing with each other and trying to fight for the same potential customers, trying to negotiate that as the ISAC in the middle of that and trying to remain vendor neutral is another thing that we have to negotiate. So I don't know where commercial threat intelligence is going to go, but I just know that there are so many dynamics there that are getting in the way of sharing that sooner or later we have to address. Now let's talk for a minute about unstructured threat intelligence. Because everybody's all about the sticks and everything. This is a Picasso, but I think it can apply really well to security. So, this is the threat intelligence that's coming straight out of the horse's mouth. There's some illumination that probably stands for visibility. We're always looking for more visibility into our environment. There's a broken tool, a broken sword down here, maybe our IDS wet the bed. I don't know, this is probably an auditor, because there's a piece of paper. So I think this speaks to me personally, and I hope it speaks to you, about all the things that get discussed that do not fit nicely into schemas and XML and all these things. So a lot of times we will get narrative reports of things. So there's an adversary, they started doing account checking against, account validation automated against our e-commerce site. They were coming from these IPs, but as soon as they figured out that we saw them, they ratcheted it down, they started to go low and slow, they rotated through single IPs and they didn't reuse an IP any more often than once a month. That sort of thing does not fit into any level of structured exchange that you can send through taxi or anything else machine to machine, but it's incredibly valuable. Or the steps that somebody is taking to commit PayPal fraud by going halfway through the steps to set up a bank account just long enough so that PayPal will verify it and then abandoning it. That sort of set of techniques and that sort of thing is a lot of what we exchange, and it's very, very useful. But there's no way to really, strip those out and just form them, in indicators. So we're also having trouble trying to figure out how to archive that kind of discussion. And usually it's a long email thread and somebody's throwing something in, somebody's saying something else. Putting that all together, it's hard to do it any way except maybe in a prose report. So, you know, there are just not, we're probably never going to get to this great utopia where things are being shared machine to machine all over the world, all over the country, and we are responding like that just to everything, because a lot of the best intelligence that we're exchanging are stories, and stories don't fit into structure. And one more problem that we have is the velvet rope problem. Everything I mentioned before about our members not wanting to, you know, contribute too much information to vendors because they're worried about that, that creates a velvet rope, you know, that we'd really like to be able to bring down. Another problem is that everybody wants to be anonymous when they share their info, but they don't want you to be anonymous when you share your info. And I can understand that, because the reason is that they really want to know the source. Especially the top-level analysts want to know who is contributing, because they want to know if you know what you're talking about, because they don't have the time to go through everything they receive. So if they're getting something from somebody they know and trust and say, yeah, you know, they're really on top of it, they'll look at that first. So that's another problem. How do you sift out groups of people who want to talk on the same level? The threat analysts who are working at this all day are going to have very different perspectives on what threat intelligence they're digging up. They're going to focus more on threat actors, on TTPs, whereas the less mature ones are going to be saying, you know, just tell me what to block. But you don't want to create elite groups where nobody, you know, you can't get in. You have to know somebody to get into this sharing group. We don't want to do that either. So again, this is a sociological sort of thing. It's, you know, it's difficult. One thing that we are doing in the ISAC is we have a group that is just for full-time threat analysts from our member organizations. It's not like, hey, we like you, we trust you, we're bringing you in. We're just going to say, this is what you do all day, and therefore we understand that you are going to have a different perspective and a different level of attention, you know, to the discussion that's going on. So at least we're grouping it that way, and we're trying to make sure that's fair. But that's another problem. So really what I'm saying is technology is not sufficient. I don't want to diss on technology, but there are just so many human aspects to this threat intel sharing that are not going to get addressed by those. So it would really be nice if we could keep up with everything in the old antivirus model by just sharing it fast enough. But this is not, I don't think this is practical. You're welcome to come and argue with me about it afterwards. I'd love to hear about it if you have a different perspective on it. But not everybody likes sticks and taxis. Some people like crits. Some people have their own homegrown stuff. As I mentioned, there are granular concerns about sharing indicators. For every step in the chain where you're sharing something, there's often a discussion about, can we share this indicator part of it? No, take that part out. Or, well, okay, we've gotten this far with our name, but now if you're going to share it outside of this group, you got to take our name off it. So there's always that. And then, you know, at the end of the day, which is apparently when a lot of things happen at the end of the day, if you've watered everything down to the point where you can share it within a whole community as TLP green, and, you know, it's not supposed to be public, but it's okay if it does, kinda, it's probably much later, like weeks later, and it's watered down to the point where it doesn't have any useful details in it anymore. And again, this is just my kind of cynicism, but I suspect this is kind of where we're going. Now I'm going to talk about the cyberpocalypse, otherwise known as the Department of Homeland Security's exercise this year, Cyberstorm 5. Yes, the cyber is coming for you. So I don't know how much I can actually talk about it yet, because I know the after report's been written, but I don't know if it's been published. Let's just say it was a very devilishly clever scenario, and it worked against the things that we usually do when we are responding and mitigating the types of attacks that we usually expect. So it was very well constructed. But I will talk to you about, you know, the lessons that we learned. So as things were virtually in smoking heaps and there were holes and a rocket to Mars blew up and things like that, this was a scenario that was supposed to affect cross-sector government, federal government, state government, healthcare, retail, financials, across the board, so that something for every player who took part in this exercise. We found, first of all, that politics always plays a role everywhere. There were groups sitting at the same exercise table who did not want to talk with each other. And no, I'll do it. No, I'll do it. No, we're the center of excellence for this. No, we are the center of excellence for this. We're a government institution, so we have all these rules that we have to follow, and we have to normalize this data and everything before we can get back to you. There was one portion of the federal government who I contacted as part of the exercise at the beginning of the 3-day exercise. I never heard back from them. Not even an automated thank you for your submission, we'll get back to you sort of thing. But the really interesting thing that I found out at the end is because of the solution that we found, that we came across, and by the way, it was PayPal that came up with the solution. They have some really sharp guys there. The next step, as soon as we brought it to the US CERT, they said, okay, great, you won, exercise is over. But the really interesting, important part would have been following up on that, because what it was we were going to need to get some code to everyone who's affected by this, but in such a way that the adversary wasn't tipped off, because otherwise they could set off a bomb and explode everything. So if you think about trying to notify people who you have never talked to and never met, who may not have a security group, how are you going to do this? Figure out whether they can spell PGP, talk to them about whether they can use this on their own or whether you have to stand up a SAS to do it for them. This, I think, would have been the biggest challenge of the whole exercise, and I would have loved to continue with that because I think that was the hard part. How can we do this? And how can we do it at scale? Because the other lesson that we learned is that government doesn't scale. They will say it themselves, government does not scale. They cannot do the sort of centralized work under the constraints that we put them on as taxpayers and respond as quickly as, say, a PayPal can. 2 people on a phone going, okay, I'm working on this. Oh, yeah, I got it. Okay. The private sector is going to be a lot more agile just because they're not under the same constraints. And so it's going to be up to us to work together if there is an event like that occurs across the world or across the US, across sectors. It's going to be all of us talking to each other and passing things along that is going to make the difference. So that's kind of scary, but it's also, kind of interesting. How are we going to do that? As part of the retail ISAC, I deal with ad hoc notifications where, they're not a member, but a security researcher will come to us and say, we have files for a bunch of retailers, data on reshipping fraud or whatever, transaction numbers, shipping addresses, that sort of thing. Can you distribute those for us? And I'm like, okay, how many you got? Oh, about 300. And so it begins. Taking these files, and you don't want to just send them out, and publicly. We try to be sensitive and just contact each retailer personally and say, we have a file with your stuff in it. Can we give it to you? This isn't all that easy to do. Sometimes I will know somebody, sometimes I'll go through LinkedIn, a couple of ways and reach somebody. If it's an insider threat, I can't just email them about it. I have to try to get somebody on the phone and say, I can't talk to you about what it is yet, but can you just get on the phone with me? No, I'm not trying to sell you anything. Can you just get on the phone with me? It's very, very hard. Sometimes I'll be typing into customer support forms on retailer websites, and they'll come back and say, oh, we are sorry you did not like your dress, madame. And I'll say, no, I'm trying to get a hold of your security group. I'm sorry, that is against our policy. And so doing these things one by one is turning out to be the greatest challenge, opportunity of my career, trying to figure out how to reach all of these people. So that's a big thing. We also need sharing mechanisms. I found out that even the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Group has a little issue with giving me the right PGP key. So figuring out how to, I have a file for you. How would you like me to send it to you? Can I just send it in email? Do you want it encrypted? Do you want it, Do you want it password protected? How do you want me to get you the password? It's really big. How do you want me to get it to you? This is another thing that we have to work on. Healthcare is already doing this with a lot of the secure messaging, for their clients who are, just consumers who really have no idea what to do except that they get an email saying there's a secure message for you. We need something like that, but probably a little bit more robust, because again, we have to vet the other side before we can send them stuff. And then, as I mentioned, keeping OPSEC in place. Whether it's my calling somebody and saying, okay, can you stand, you have an insider, I don't know if they're on your help desk. I don't know where they are. If they're in the PBX, I don't want to leave you a voicemail. Can you go stand in front of the fax machine and I'll send it to you? Working out whatever channels are going to work for the two of you at that time. Is another thing that you should be thinking about. So for your own organizations, think about how easy are you to contact? Are your customer support people ready to deal with a query that comes in? And also how to vet whether it's a legitimate thing. Microsoft with their bug bounty program has to deal with all sorts of crazy people submitting stuff. So their people have to be trained in telling the difference between somebody who knows what he's talking about and somebody who's just yanking their chain. No, that's a word bug. That's really not an attack. So, takeaways. What does this mean for you? I don't know. You tell me. Really, it means that you need to build up your Rolodex, because it is always going to be between you and somebody else. You always need to know somebody to call, and you never know why you might need to call them. So yes, even with the LinkedIn breach aside and everything, using as many different networks as you can to connect with people and know who is where and who's working on what is going to be very, very useful. Be prepared to use any communication channel that works. Have a few in hand. Be really explicit about sharing restrictions. I do not want, don't assume anything. Yeah, I'm just going to send this out to the membership, okay? Oh, well, who's in the membership? What do you mean by that? Which parts can we share? Try the templates. Try making up your own templates. This is the sort of thing we feel comfortable sharing. We want to do it on a regular basis. Is this okay? Can we just go ahead and do this? But really, I'm a fan of using whatever works. If you have to bribe people, do that. I must say the RVAsec organizers did a great job last night of taking us from beer place to beer place to beer place to beer place. I would do anything for Jake right now. Never underestimate the power of that stuff. But the one thing I want to point out is a lot of folks out there are automating their threat intelligence processing process, their analysis and everything. But if you are getting to that, do not forget the sharing stage. I have seen presentations where they say, oh, we have all of this wonderfully automated. Where was the point where you were going to tell us about that? So think about that too, if you can possibly automate any of it, especially if you've already gotten templates approved ahead of time. That would be a great thing. So thank you all for having me here. I've wanted to attend RVAsec for a long time, and I'm grateful that I got an excuse to come do it. And if you'd like to talk more about this, Mr. Bianco's right down here, and there are other great experts in the audience. So thank you, and let's make this a great conference.